honor and pleasure to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Ann Simpson. So let me tell you a little bit about Ann's very impressive background. Ann is currently the Senior Portfolio Manager of Investments and Director of Corporate Governance at the California Public Employee Retirement System, or CalPERS. So how many of you have heard of CalPERS? Okay, well they're fairly well educated on CalPERS. Well, here's what you may not know about CalPERS. It is the largest pension fund in the United States. It has approximately $230 billion under management. That's billion with a B. So this is an extraordinarily important financial services company here in the Sacramento region. And it has an extraordinary leadership position also on topics relating to corporate governance. And historically, CalPERS has been a true leader and innovator in encouraging companies to enhance the strength of their corporate governance processes and structures. It has been a global leader in that area, and Ann is the leader of corporate governance at CalPERS. So we're really, really thrilled to have her with us today. Let me say a little bit more about her background. She's a senior faculty fellow at the Yale School of Management and is a member of the investor advisory group of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. She sits on the editorial advisory board for the journal Corporate Governance and International Review, which is published by Blackwell's. She was co-author of Fair Shares, The Future of Shareholder Power and Responsibility, published by Oxford University Press. Her former roles include Executive Director of the International Corporate Governance Network, Head of the World Bank, OECD Global Corporate Governance Forum, and Joint Managing Director of Pension and Investment Research Consultants. And she did an undergraduate degree at Oxford in politics, philosophy, and economics. She's a great friend of me personally and of the school, and we're very excited about our deepening partnership with CalPERS. So please join me in welcoming Ann.
Oh, thank you very much, Stephen. I'm not sure in front of your students, I should probably call you thank you very much, Dean, as a mark of respect, but thank you for inviting me to be here. And this is an exciting day for everyone in the room. It's the beginning of your MBA program. It's an extraordinarily important phase in your life because I look around and see the many challenges that we have in the economy, in wider society, globally and at home. And the good news is that all of you will be in charge in a short while. So doing this MBA is your opportunity to have the ideas, get the information, the learning, and also probably to forge the friendships that will take you through a lifetime in your business career. So what I thought this morning, as it's the beginning of your MBA program, is that I would talk to you for a short while about something very simple and perhaps obvious, which is the company, the corporation, something we rather take for granted. I think when all of you were coming to this morning's event here at the wonderful campus at UC Davis, this glorious sunny morning, I'd like you just to sit and count off on your fingers how many companies you think were involved in getting you here. And that was everything from turning on the tap with water to clean your teeth, the toothpaste, the electricity. You probably came in a car. I've no doubt you were driving on a road. The oil, the petrol, the iPod, the laptop, everything that you were Googling and Facebooking in one of the sessions that you weren't very interested in earlier. All of this, at the end of the day, even the coffee that propelled you here when you were really struggling to get out of bed, we know that every single aspect of our life is touched by the corporation. So what I want to talk to you about a little bit this morning is, where did the corporation come from? How was it invented? and pose a question to you as future corporate leaders, which is it meeting our needs and wants? We understand finance, we understand profit. At CalPERS, we're a pension fund, so actually companies being profitable is fundamental to us doing our job, which is paying pensions, not just now, but over the next 50 to 60 years. We're very long-term investors. But I want to walk you through some thoughts about the importance of what the company is and the purpose of the corporation, and really then finish handing over to you to ask some questions about what your role will be as leaders. So let's begin with a delightful quote from the rather mischievous Ambrose Bierce in The Devil's Dictionary. This is at the beginning of the 20th century. His explanation of what a corporation was, or is it is an ingenious device for obtaining individual profit without individual responsibility. And this issue about rights and responsibility, benefits and costs, I think runs right through the debate about what companies are for. So let's think a little about that. Companies were invented as a form hundreds of years ago. I mean, well before the United States was invented. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But let's just get a sense of the scale and the impact of the modern corporation. Now, the biggest company in our portfolio today is the most valuable company in the world. It's Apple. They're local. So I want to just tell you a few things about Apple. First of all, their turnover, their revenues, their value this morning, it's greater than the GDP of Poland or Saudi Arabia, Belgium. If you had access to the United States gold reserves, you couldn't afford to buy Apple. There's not enough in the coffers. On the other hand, also, the value of Apple, if you could cash that in, you could actually bankroll Greek debt more than once. You could sort of roll it over. And maybe Angela Merkel would be delighted if that was available to her. Now, because Apple's the biggest and probably one of the most innovative companies, and 10 years ago, remember, it was valued at something like $7 billion, sort of barely a blip on the radar screen. So we think about what's happened with Apple. So one of my wonderful team members at CalPERS put this chart together, Ashley Taylor, thank you for this, to actually give us a sense of some other favourite names in the corporate community, to think really about the size and the scale of the corporation. So Nike, their revenue is bigger than the GDP of Paraguay. McDonald's, I'm loving it, apparently, is bigger than Latvia. Costco, bigger than the Sudan. ExxonMobil, bigger than Thailand. General Electric dwarfs New Zealand. Amazon dwarfs Kenya. Bank of America, turnover bigger than Vietnam. And guess what? Walmart has a value greater than the GDP of Norway. So the first thing we can conclude from this is really that the corporation, this ancient but rather simple invention, has been a phenomenal success. There's probably not an aspect of our daily lives not touched by companies, but also the global reach and the impact of the corporation is extraordinary. And for that reason, we really need to think about the governance, because the accumulation of resources, of power, of wealth, and also the expectations that we have of companies are mounting all the time. So let's think about what some of those might be. Now, we've just looked at companies which make hamburgers and soda and cars. And it's easy to think that really companies are there for providing the luxuries of life, the trivia and the clutter that all of our apartments or houses are bursting with, things that we don't actually need. And let's think about what people need as opposed to what they want. This is the global environment in which you will be leaders. We have a population of almost 7 trillion people. Where did trillion come from? It's billion. There's somebody been thinking about reproduction in a very energetic way. As a lapsed Catholic, I would understand how that would happen. It's actually nearly 7 billion. Billion, trillion, squillion. It's a lot. But the importance of this slide is to say that in the global population, 20%, that's 1 in 5 people don't have access to electricity. Think about all the things that come with that. Access to the internet, electric light, all the conveniences, not just of the light bulb, thank you Mr. Edison, but the whole infrastructure network with electricity. There's nearly 1 billion people who don't have access to clean drinking water. Again, that's a huge health challenge, and it also has a dramatic impact on people's daily lives, particularly women, who are usually the ones charged with children of finding clean water for households. And also, this is, I think, probably one of the most shocking numbers, nearly 40% don't have access to sanitation. And that is therefore a source of disease, misery, discomfort. If any of you have been travelling countries which don't have a good infrastructure for sanitation, you will smell that the minute that you get off the plane. And we don't understand, unless we look back through the history books, that basic infrastructure for sanitation has been as important as anything that was ever done to actually contribute to human welfare. For that reason, I'm sure some of you heard recently that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has got a new project, and they're having a competition to redesign the toilet. Now, Sir Thomas Crapper, English gentleman that he was, who invented the flushing lavatory, if you think about it, his basic design hasn't been overhauled since he invented it. So this is a fantastic project, but the charge is that this should be a facility which doesn't require any infrastructure, doesn't require being hooked up to a water system or to electricity or anything else that we would expect. So I think watch this, because for me we're talking about innovation with iPads and iPods and the cloud and who knows what else, but actually in terms of impact on people's lives, probably to get a decent alternative to Sir Thomas Crapper's invention is of first order. So I applaud the Gates family. So we've got this situation of fantastic success for the company in terms of size and scale. But you'll all be aware, because you read the papers, you look online, you see the scandals, you see the court cases. Company executives, chief executives, could not be more unpopular and jostle with used car salesmen and politicians at the very bottom of the list for the public's disdain, for their anger, and at times for contempt. And we can see that there have been particular instances of corporate malfeasance, corporate incompetence, which have led to that, but also we've seen some systemic problems. Obviously, during the financial crisis, the build-up of the subprime mortgage horror story led to a series of consequences through an interconnected financial system that, you know, the United States and other economies are still very burdened by. And if we were to try to quantify the human misery behind that tale, which certainly couldn't be told in numbers. But we've also seen specific issues which have really bothered the wider society, like executive pay. There's one calculation that's been done which says, well, over the last 30 years, executive pay has increased 250 times more than average employees' pay. So I suppose you could, on the one hand, say we're more unpopular than ever as chief executives, but we're better paid for it. I'm not sure that really is an equation that anybody is comfortable with. And then we've got particular concerns around issues like short-termism, which is an ugly word, but it's really something which is now endemic in our financial system, whereby the chasing of the short term is undermining the ability to plan for the long term. And we've got wider issues around environmental risk, not minding challenges about the role of corporations in terms of tax, their interaction with the political system through the donations that are made from shareholders' funds, and a whole string of others, no doubt. And this is something we can talk about in a minute. Do we think Ambrose Bierce was right? Or certainly there's a kernel of truth in his observation, which is out there in the popular imagination. So let's go back a little bit. I think we sometimes think that these concerns about the company, the nature of corporate power, the purpose of the corporation, as something which really is a post-war phenomenon. I saw in the New York Times the other day somebody writing about When Capitalists Cared was the title. And the example was Henry Ford. He said, well, during the Depression, Henry Ford decided he would pay his workers $5 a day, well in excess of the minimum wage, because he felt it was a duty of his to make sure that in hard times people could pay their bills, but also it would allow them to buy a Model T Ford. He understood the virtuous circle between private profit and public interest. However, what the writer was not aware of, or perhaps didn't refer to, is that poor old Henry Ford was taken to court by the Dodge brothers. Wonderful name. They had 10% of the company. They were rivals in the car industry, and they sued him successfully for not paying a special dividend, and instead, as they saw it, squandering the company's profits on things like lowering the price of the cars so that people could afford them during the Depression, raising wages so that families didn't go under in hard times. So way back, we have these real tussles about the purpose of the corporation, the distribution of profit, and this question about the governance, who decides, who controls this, has been there at the very beginning. And it's one, when you're in charge, that you'll be taking on too. But I did want to just put this quote up from Adam Smith. I love this because it's from his book, his second book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Nothing gets called just the wealth of nations as though somehow that happens. He was inquiring and he was interested in causes. But of course this was published in 1776, somewhat memorable date for the United States, and of course for the British ourselves. But this was Adam Smith's comment. In The Wealth of Nations, where he set out many of his ideas about the market, the invisible hand of the market, trade, the role of merchants, he commented on what was then a controversial subject, which was the joint stock company. And those of you who like to browse through these things will know that in Britain, where Adam Smith was writing, he was up in Scotland, no doubt considers itself largely an independent nation, probably it almost is. But he was writing in the shadow of the South Sea bubble. And I'm sure you've heard of tulip mania and the South Sea bubble and the extraordinary tale of the Mississippi Company, which took down most of French aristocratic debt and was formed actually by a Scottish murderer called John Law. But we're not going to talk about that right now. I just want to say that the idea of the company was born into controversy, even as far back as Adam Smith. And really what Smith was talking about, as he says, negligence and profusion, therefore must always prevail, more or less, in the management of the affairs of a company. And what he was commenting is on one of the chief features of a company, which is it's not really about using your own money. The first responsibility in the company is to accept that you are using other people's money. Of course, if CalPERS is one of your investors, we'll be paying great attention to what's happening. But this fiduciary concept that you are, when you receive external capital, that you're receiving other people's money, leads to concerns about the impact and then what happens. So what happened in the South Sea bubble was as follows. Essentially, the British government was in debt. There's no surprise, is it? It's been going on a long time. European debt was at the heart of some of those early scandals even then. And the South Sea Company was invented in order to, say, take money from the public and say, what we are going to do is trade in the South Seas. Think of Argentina, which didn't exist then. And they were trading in slaves, trading in all sorts of other commodities to and fro, without sort of thinking through the fact that actually at that point England was at war with Spain, didn't have access to those trade routes. So the excitement around this company rose and rose and rose, and sure enough, the government raised an enormous amount of money. But what happened when the bubble, even then, think about this is 1720, this company, the word bubble was invented that long back. The company imploded because, of course, there was nothing to actually base any of these promises of riches upon. And what happened in Parliament, the impact on Britain was so profound and dramatic economically that Parliament, in its wisdom, just decided, well, we're not having any more of that. We will not have any more companies. Well, we've got a few that are going on and they're necessary to empire, like the East Indies Company and the Hudson Bay Corporation and so forth. But there will be no new joint stock companies. And the Bubble Act, as it was called, was passed in 1722, and companies were banned in the UK for over 100 years. I mean, that makes Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank really look quite pitiful as a response. No, we're not having that anymore. Of course, this rather suited the monarchy, because instead, if you wanted to go about some business, you had to be well connected in high places, petition the monarchy, and have a royal charter. So business could still be transacted. You'd be given your license, your monopoly. And of course, really, this was a good example of the state, the monarchy, being anchored to the corporation in cahoots, if you like, for the trade that really supported the empire. And we can talk more about these examples, but what I want to say is really that at the very beginning of the invention of the corporation, it was a very contested purpose. Let me give you one more example, which isn't perhaps as well known. When the Nazis, the National Socialists, were elected in 1936, were they elected in Germany? 1933, thank you. We know the consequences. We know from the history books and from what we've learned and what we've been told, and from our own relatives, what took place in World War II. But there's a little piece of how the National Socialists, the Nazis, took control of industry, which isn't very well known, which is that in 1937, they passed something called the Shareholder Rights Act, which sounds like a wonderful thing. But what they did was abolish the duty of the corporation to look after the interests of shareholders, and substitute instead the Führer principle, that the duty was to the leader. And this, a little bit of legal tinkering on the corporate purpose was then followed by reforms and changes to the way that votes were exercised. And they did things like cancel postal voting or voting by mail. There's no electronic voting in those days, of course. But what they did was obviously go ahead and nationalise the banks. They hadn't got the money or the resources to nationalise the rest of industry, but industry was to be anchored to that political purpose of Nazism, and they did it through tinkering around with things that we think of as corporate governance, the purpose of the corporation and the casting of votes. And the unravelling of that apparatus was a big part of the denazification process in Germany, when the Allies took over. So that sad story, that sad episode, that manipulation of corporate purpose is a good example of something which I think gets forgotten, because the companies are things. They're not people. I know there is a legal concept and there is even legal judgment in this country which says a corporation is a person. But this is not a person in the sense that you and I are people. It's not a person in the sense of having volition or responsibility, moral agency, the ability to make decisions. I saw there was a documentary a couple of years ago called The Corporation, in which an economist said, well, if the corporation was a person, they'd be considered a psychopath because of their inability to empathize with others. Come on, this is ridiculous, because the company is not a person. It's a thing. The best we can think of is that it's a robot, something that we have invented and we are responsible for. And Ira Milstein, who I taught with at Yale, had this wonderful analogy with Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. And he thought that the 3 laws of robotics from Isaac Asimov should be applied to companies. And he's one of the top lawyers in Wall Street. If you want to read more about Ira's view on that, let me know afterwards. So let's move on. Companies were invented to meet certain purposes. Those purposes could be benign, they could be nefarious. They're always contested. But the simple design of the company is still with us. So first of all, the idea of the company itself is a separate entity from the business. That means that the company can continue even if whatever the company's doing goes out of style. And that's very different from, say, a guild. So if you're there in medieval England making woolen stockings and your guild of stocking knitters, your activity, and woolen stockings go out of fashion, as they did. Gentlemen wear trousers, do they not? These days. Actually, the company by being a separate legal entity, is a way of continuing, even though the activities within the company can change. So that's a good thing. That's obviously a way to be adaptable. The second thing about a company is the ability to receive capital and to aggregate capital, and that's the concept of being joint stock. So first of all, it's a thing, separate from the business, and then you can buy and sell bits of the thing. That's the shares in the company. You're not buying 1/24th of the woolen knitting business. You're buying a piece of the company, which is the legal entity that represents the ownership of that activity. So that's a good thing. And of course, the revisiting of the Bubble Act and the banning of companies in the UK, no surprise, it happened when the UK needed to have a bout of capital raising to fund its colonial ambitions and the Industrial Revolution and all that goes with it. So the joint stock company allowed aggregation of capital. But then there's something which wasn't around in Adam Smith's time and only came in the middle of the 19th century. It's very, very important. It's the concept of limited liability. This meant that even though a company would go into debt, horrible, dreadful, terrible things would happen, perhaps, you were only going to be on the hook for the value of your shares. And until limited liability was battled through and contested politically in many places, corporations had unlimited liability, and in that sense, when things went wrong, it wasn't just you, it was everything you owned and the shirt on your back, and as they say, the shoes to go with them. So the idea of limiting liability was in order to encourage the public to put their money into these enterprises. And the next thing to say about this balancing act on gathering capital, that was the purpose of the company when it was invented, was to ensure that it was possible for those who provided the capital to look after themselves. So the very early versions of the company's law included shareholder rights, like the ability to hire and fire the board. That makes sense. You're not going to be there, you're not part of the management, you've just given them your money. Make sure the people looking after that money or overseeing it are to your liking and working in your interest. That makes sense. Secondly, shareholders from early on in this sort of primitive legal framework in the UK had the ability to call meetings, to put resolutions forwards, and, right from the beginning, to receive financial information. So obviously one of the things in the early days of trading is ships would set sail and come back 5 years later, and you hadn't got a clue what was going on in the meantime. But anyway, all of this apparatus, very simple apparatus, I would say we're still fighting in corporate governance to get it in place. And that's why we'll come back to Apple. So one of the things in the United States, just for example, is that you do not, as an investor, automatically have the right to hire and fire the board. That is something that's given to you or not in state law. And if state law says, well, you don't have to have that power, you have to, as a shareholder, then go into a major negotiation. So one of the things we did this year with Apple was file, the second year running, a proposal saying we would like the ability to vote no on the board. We didn't at that point have big concerns about the board at Apple, but it seems foolish with a company which for us is the biggest in our portfolio to really think that we can vote yes on the board, but we can't vote no. And another thing in the United States, it's not only that you don't have the automatic right to be able to vote yes and no on the board, you also don't have the ability to put forward alternative candidates. Because you could say, well, when things are really getting tough, things are really going wrong, as the provider of capital, you say, this really isn't working. These directors are not acting in our interest. We need to put new people forwards. So another thing we did this year, we had two companies, Chesapeake Energy and Neighbours. Chesapeake you may have heard of because they're at the centre of the controversy around fracking. They're a natural gas company, but they also had some controversial issues like a founder's well program in which $1 billion or more was lent to the chief executive, the founder of the company, but this wasn't sort of actually explained anywhere in the accounts. So one of the things that's happened for the first time, those two companies, is a shareholder proposal which we solicited for actually passed. So we've now got a wrestling match with those companies, say, well, you know, the majority of shareholders say they want the ability to put candidates forward to the board because your financial performance is dreadful and there are all these other issues to deal with about your long-term strategy, and we don't have confidence in the people on the board. So come on, we're giving you the chance to sort things out, but now it's time to bring new people in. But we're still wrestling over the basics. So I think for you as corporate leaders, one of the things to think about is that the corporation requires accountability for the exercise of power. And if that's to be effective, that means the providers of capital have to have the right to exercise for their own protection, but I think also wider society needs this. It's a question of, if not us, then who? If not we, then who? If it's not shareholders, who will you turn to, or who do we turn to in wider society to exercise that role? Could be government. Other countries do that. It could be workers. We could put workers on the board, as they have in Germany, France, Sweden, other countries. It could be regulators. Well, they have a tough time already, don't they, keeping up with events? Or we just rely on, the watchdogs and the snapping at the heels, the media, the auditors. I mean, it seems absolutely right to me, the alignment of interest is between the providers of capital and the company. So as you go into your business setting, as you think about your future, this issue of accountability, transparency that must go with that, and of course, ultimately, responsibility. So let me wrap up. I'm looking around the room. I said to Stephen, have you got a clock somewhere? Maybe you'll just have a big buzzer that will go off at some point. So enough. We've heard enough. All right. This chart, perhaps you can't read it very well, but it's just a thought I want to leave with you, because you will be in charge. I mean, unless you flunk this course and UC Davis kick you out, this isn't going to happen. You're the part-time MBA students. You're the hard-working people who already have a job, have a life, and on top of that are doing your MBA. So you are high-functioning, high-performing, hard-working people. So when you come to be in charge, some of these issues are going to be ahead of you as a corporate leader. This is a chart from the World Economic Forum, and every year they do a survey. This is my copy that I'm meant to fill in, which I haven't done yet because I sort of got lost halfway through. They were asking about everything from what do I think is happening with chronic fiscal imbalances. This is the piece at the bottom. Great risks ahead of everyone. How are we going to navigate that? Then they've got another cluster of questions around critical systems failure. Might be cyber terrorism, might be collapse of data fraud and theft. We know there's controversies at the moment, even around basic rights to privacy with some companies. Up at the top, they've got greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, think about it, water scarcity, how much of current industrial and corporate activity is based on the assumption that there's a continuing supply of water, there's an ample supply of electricity, which in turn is all linked into a well-defined, well-organized energy policy. If you start ticking that box off, and companies like Coca-Cola are doing it at the moment, you really see that within 7 or 8 years, what you think you could be doing isn't constrained by money, it isn't constrained by demand. That's old-fashioned economics, isn't it? It's actually constrained by the lack of water. And another on the right, which we've already looked at, is the question of population growth. This is about water use, it's also about food shortages, it's about the management of an aging population, how we provide healthcare. So you can look at this, and there's a wonderful explanation, and Stephen mentioned China, but the Chinese character for danger is made up of 2 characters, one for risk and one for opportunity. And that is really, for me, the map of danger, but it is a risk. These are risks that you're going to have to be thinking about and navigating, but it's also the opportunity for corporate solutions, for innovation. This is just a little reminder that we're in a rotten place when it all goes wrong. It regularly does. Expect things to go wrong. What do they say? Hope for the best and plan for the worst. Okay, so just to wrap up, CalPERS, what are we doing? So, as Stephen said, CalPERS is a very big fund. We're talking about companies. CalPERS, if you're going to map us in the same way we were in a mischievous way mapping companies, we're about the size of the GDP of Portugal. So there we go. We measure ourselves similarly. We've been thinking about what is it that we need to do as owners? What do we take on our shoulders as responsibility? Because there is no safe place for CalPERS to invest if the system doesn't work. You can't take $250 billion and find some companies to tuck that money into. We have an interest in the economy functioning. We have an interest in financial market stability. And traditionally, we have spent more time thinking about individual companies, like Chesapeake, like Neighbours, like Apple, on specific things. But we all know in investment, it's asset allocation, it's high-level decisions that determine your risk and return. So what we've done is develop a new framework, which we're now rolling through our investment strategy. And it's really thinking about the creation of value rather than individual strategies, individual decisions. All of that's good stuff. Sometimes you get it right, often you don't. But really, we're getting back to some old-fashioned economics, which is that value comes from three forms of capital. Financial capital, obviously that's provided by investors like us. Human capital, these are the people in companies. There is no company without people in the company. Just leave a bag of money on the pavement, on the sidewalk, nothing will happen, I assure you. You might think that there is a real economy out there with day trading and nano trading and nanosecond trading, but there is an underlying wealth creation that we need to pay attention to. And the third form of capital is obvious, it's physical capital. Companies need things, they need resources. If it's not water and electricity, at the very least, they're going to need a smartphone. And running shoes, a bus ticket or a car. There's going to be some transport or something involved. And what we're doing is essentially thinking about what are the issues in these three forms of capital. We're working with UC Davis on a research project which will identify what those issues are and how we can develop evidence and metrics around those issues. But I would suggest for you as a corporate leader, thinking about your responsibilities for these three forms of capital could be helpful in terms of thinking, what's my job as a chief executive? You're going to have to deal with the shareholders. You're definitely, and should be perhaps even first, thinking about your employees and your customers, the human dimension. And the physical capital, depending on the sector that you're in, could well be at the very top of your agenda. But the three together in combination will make all the difference. So we've looked a little bit at the history. The company was born into controversy, and thus it has been ever since. We've seen companies used for nefarious purposes. We've seen companies having the ability to be a vehicle for the creation of great wealth and meeting of human need. And we also know that there's unmet need of an exceptional and both distressing level, but also a huge opportunity for companies. So I thought it would be nice to finish with this, because if there was another message I would want to give you, starting your MBA class, is have imagination. That is probably one of the most undervalued things in a business leader. And I think it was said best by Lewis Carroll through the voice of the White Queen. And you all know Alice in Wonderland, yes? Well, there was another book, Alice Through the Looking Glass, which is also hilarious. And if you like logic and you like games, you should read it. But Alice is laughing because the Queen has just told her that she's 101 years old. And imagine in Victorian Britain, that sounded ridiculous, didn't it? People died before they were 50. I'm 101 years old, and Alice laughed. One cannot believe impossible things, says Alice. She's a very sensible little girl, as you remember. And the Queen replies, I dare say you haven't had much practice. When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast, which I think is very good advice for an MBA student. So let's finish with Louis Brandeis. He, one of the most important legal figures in the United States, was the first Jewish Supreme Court justice in the United States, had a remarkable impact at a critical time in the United States economic development. But this is really the wisdom of Alice rewritten by a Supreme Court justice. And I think it's good advice for all of you as you embark on your course at UC Davis. He said, most of the things worth doing in the world had been declared impossible before they were done. So I wish all of you well. I hope I can come back when you're graduating, find out how you got on. and you've got important studies ahead. And all of us out there living and watching the problems that are around us are very glad that there's a new generation coming behind us to make a better job of everything. Thank you. Yeah, no. I'm sorry, I talked so long. I've used all the question time out. That's awful. I just got carried away. We can take a few questions, says the Dean. Questions, comments, differences of opinion? You want me to recite the Jabberwocky, something else from Lewis Carroll? Somebody, yeah, and somebody at the front here as well.
Someone in the back, Kathy, first one in the back, and then
Good morning. I have a question about how CalPERS balances its duty as a holder of California general obligation debt that is also dependent upon the same revenue stream in the event of a shortfall. How do CalPERS internal governance policies reconcile that potential conflict?
Right. So we're under a fiduciary duty which is set out in the California Constitution, and that supersedes, is higher than, governs everything that goes on. So even the legislature or the day-to-day activities in California, even laws that are passed in California have to live under that fiduciary duty. So you know we're in a state agency, but the investment office is governed by that. So there is no balancing, I'm afraid. It's our fiduciary duty is to our beneficiaries, full stop, period, you'd say. No balance. It's just fiduciary duty first. And there was a question here too.
I just wanted to know what sort of programs or services you might have affiliated with UC Davis to help develop people possibly looking to work with CalPERS, or summer associate programs, things like that, to possibly even help make a transition from one industry into another, particularly finance.
Yeah, so CalPERS has a number of programs. We have worked with groups like the Twigo Foundation to do days and trips and tours. Until the first of this month, we also had students who worked at CalPERS, which was like a paid internship. And unfortunately, that has just been cancelled as part of the cost-cutting measures that were agreed between the SEIU and the authorities. So we're in the process of seeing how we can convert those positions. The students, I've had 5 students on my team, and we've had students both in the graduate and postgraduate world, and they've been wonderful. They've been a fantastic contributor. But at the moment, the current environment is absolutely rotten for that. But there are internship programs like the Polanco Fellowship, Twigo and others, and I'd be glad to pass more details on if anyone's interested. Thank you.
Anne, thank you so much for your fascinating remarks. And we do have some of our graduates who work at CalPERS, actually, so there is a path there. So, but I just want to say a few words of thanks to Anne, and what an extraordinary organization. So she mentioned a minute ago that the financial assets under management at CalPERS is about the same as, was it GDP of Portugal?
Yeah.
So we have Portugal just in Sacramento. So it's quite an amazing comparison. So, and what you've heard this morning in her remarks are really two important themes. One is this whole topic of corporate governance, which is, I think, the most interesting and important topic facing our country today in terms of the economy. And we've got to learn more about corporate governance, get it refined and adjusted so our companies can be better functioning, can create more surplus and more jobs. And so I just can't imagine a more important topic for our economy, and I can't imagine a more well-qualified and interesting speaker for us this morning than the leader of corporate governance at CalPERS, which is really a worldwide leader on this topic. And then the second thing that you got this morning already is we talked a little bit in the Q&A about the school's emphasis on global issues. Well, you have just heard from a global person, okay? She has a global perspective. She has a global background, and so she did a great deal to reinforce that point of the global perspective of the school. So, Anne, we have a little gift for you here to convey our thanks for your time and your effort today and being with us.
Oh, thank you very much. I'll have to reimburse you for it.
Okay. All right. We'll work on that.
Well, as long as it's just a bag of tissue paper.
Right. It's not just tissue paper, so they're...
I'm just explaining that the CalPERS gift policy means I would probably have to reimburse Stephen for whatever he's given me. But I will treasure this memento. Thank you.
We will comply with whatever policies are required. So.
Thank you so much.
Anyway, Anne, absolutely terrific to have you here, and we certainly look forward to our deepening partnership with CalPERS. So.